Cockpit technology has made the skies safer for everyone. But computers can't stop every disaster.
This is one of the first fly-by-wire aircraft. It will do things to prevent the pilot from making mistakes.
So why does one descent end in tragedy? Investigators struggle to understand what happened.
Any accident where there's loss of life needs to be understood.
Previous disasters provide the clues.
Southern 932, can you hear me?
The Marshall plane crash has often been called the greatest air tragedy in American sports history.
When pilots are put under pressure, technology is pushed beyond the limit.
It just sounded like a huge explosion that came from the back of the plane.
Such disasters are incredibly rare. But when descents go out of control, the results can be deadly. June 26, 1988, Habsheim Airshow in eastern France. The public are promised the first glimpse of the brand new Airbus A320. This A320 is one of the first ever built and is packed with advanced materials and electronics.
The Airbus A320, when it came out, was a revolutionary airplane. It was the future.
The Airbus is the world's first fly-by-wire commercial airliner. Even without the pilot's input, the aircraft's computers keep the aircraft stable and correct unintended errors.
More than an evolution, it was very close to a revolution in commercial aviation.
So this is an exciting new innovative airplane, promoted as the latest and greatest, the safest, most efficient. It will do things to help the pilot. It will do things to prevent the pilot from making mistakes. And this was its introductory kind of flight to the public.
The pilots are about to show off the plane's electronics to thousands of spectators at the Habsheim Airshow, treating them to a stunt that has never been performed before. And the man chosen to show the expectant crowds what this remarkable plane is capable of is Captain Michel Aslin, a pilot with over 10,000 flying hours under his belt and almost 20 years of experience with Air France.
Then they asked me, when do you want to launch Airbus 320? You know, you have a good experience, you know well Airbus, why not? Why not? I was fascinated. It was such a nice aircraft, so such intelligent. I was in love.
In the seat next to Captain Aslin is First Officer Pierre Mazière, another highly experienced veteran Air France pilot.
My co-pilot was my best friend. We have been working together since school, and he was with me all the time, and he was a very good pilot. And then Air France asked us, okay, you make the flight together. Why not?
Unusually for an air show, the Airbus Air France demonstration will allow 130 passengers, including prize winners and children. Mariama Barret is 7 years old and is on the flight because her brother, Cédric, won 2 tickets in a local competition. Due to a seating mix-up, she is separated from her brother. "14-year-old Hervé was paralyzed in a car accident that killed his mother. His father is delighted as the flight will be a rare treat for Hervé, who is accompanied by his friend, Benoit. One of the journalists invited to give a plane's eye report on the stunt is Jean-Claude Birch.
D'avoir les journalistes à bord, c'est un privilège. Nous, on était privilégiés, mais Air France était privilégié de nous avoir à bord. Donc tout le monde était content.
Like everyone else, the press were most excited about the plane's technology.
Et puis, il y avait le copilote qui était à côté, Pierre Mazière, et il me dit, ce qu'il y a de formidable avec cet avion, c'est qu'on ne peut pas se cracher. Moi, j'ai pris la bonne place tout de suite à l'avant.
At 12:41 p.m., the Air France Airbus Flight 296 takes off from Basel-Mulhouse.
Take off, gear up, acceleration, maybe turn the flaps up. It was perfect weather.
The stunt plan is to fly the Airbus at just 100 feet and at a speed that appears to defy gravity. To add to the air of the impossible, the plane will fly with its nose up at the maximum angle it can safely fly without stalling. This angle is known as alpha max. The Airbus will be flying on the very edge of what is possible, and Captain Asleen will be pushing the plane to its limits. It's a dangerous maneuver, safeguarded by the sophisticated controls.
The Airbus fly-by-wire system said that we will only allow the airplane to a maximum angle of attack, and then we'll intervene and lower the nose even if the pilot doesn't.
The Airbus computers are built to override human error.
So these protections were built in to help the pilot fly and to make sure that if he did do something or she did something wrong, it would basically correct itself.
As Air France's technical pilot, Captain Asleen has been heavily involved in test flying the A320.
I was completely confident on the aircraft to show the aircraft its capacity.
The weather couldn't be better.
Then we make a normal speed. We're flying at, for no 220, 230 knots. No use to fly faster. A little misty over the mountains and the Vosges, but it was a very nice summer day.
They wanted to show its ability to go low and slow and amaze the crowd from below to see this large commercial airliner fly so slowly and still maintain its ability to fly.
At 12:44 p.m., Captain Asleen notices that Habsheim Airport is in sight.
Donc ces 3 minutes, on voyait le paysage très bien, parce qu'on ne devait pas avoir dépassé 300 mètres ou 400 mètres d'altitude.
The crew start the plane's descent.
Then we prepare the flight, prepare the aircraft for the low pass, set gear down, extension of flaps, reducing speed, adjusting the engine, approach checklist, everything was done. We compare our altimeter, check the normal Habsheim tower, give us the altimeter setting, we set it properly, make check and cross-check. For us, it was absolutely nothing special.
Moi, je regarde par le hublot et je vois, comment dire, le sol qui est... non, comme ça, oui, parce qu'on était très gabré. Je vois le sol incliné. Et je dis, oulala, là, il est en train de en mettre plein la vue, il est en train de faire le maximum, là. Ah, dehors, ça doit être un merveilleux spectacle.
But as the aircraft approaches the spectators, the pilots realize something is very wrong.
It's when I saw the white of the eyes of my spectators, I went to up too low.
The co-pilot, Mazière, shouts, "Toga," the term for full power.
And I said, merde, I said, shit. I had a feeling during a few part of a second, we're going to make it. So I said, maybe we're going to make it, but too late.
Et je regarde par le hublot C'est là que je me dis, mais c'est pas vrai.
When I saw that we were going to hit the ground, I was holding very firmly and I broke my seat.
Moi-même, je disais, mais attends, on est foutus, on va mourir. Et on arrive tout d'un coup avec un choc violent, tout d'un coup.
The spectators believe they have witnessed the deaths of 130 people. Miraculously, most will escape with their lives.
Alors à ce moment-là, je dis, on est intact. Mais à travers le hublot, qu'est-ce que je vois pas? Il n'y avait plus d'arbres, il n'y avait plus de forêt. Il n'y avait plus qu'un rouge. Un rouge, il y avait le feu. Le rouge des flammes, rouge-orange des flammes d'un côté. Je regarde le hublot de l'autre côté, pareil, rouge-orange. Et je dis, ben on s'en est sorti jusque-là, mais là maintenant, mourir brûlé.
It's such a shock that you have a lot of adrenaline. And this adrenaline drives you, and you are very, very fast. And you have the feeling that everything is slow.
In the cockpit, co-pilot Mazière has severe injuries.
Even with his full harness, his head went to the shield, and then he opened his forehead. It was full of blood. He passed out.
Comme j'étais juste en face ou pas loin de la porte, je connaissais le système pour ouvrir les portes d'avion et je me jette.
With the flames engulfing one side of the plane, passengers risk jumping into the dense smoke. Captain Asleen manages to carry his co-pilot out of the plane. Mariama Barre is overlooked in the chaos. In the panic, 14-year-old Hervé is left behind. One confused passenger evacuates the wrong way and disappears into the smoke. They are the only 3 people to lose their lives. Heralded as the safest plane in the air, the crash of the Airbus on its first public demonstration sends shockwaves around the aviation community. As former chairman of the National Transportation Safety Board in the United States, Mark Rosenker has studied this crash in detail.
For Airbus to have this brand new ultra-safe aircraft being demonstrated at an air show and then have it wreck into trees, to have lost an adult and 2 children through this accident, and it was primarily from fire and smoke inhalation rather than the impact, which is very unusual. To have lost anyone is one too many. It was devastating for them PR-wise.
The French Bureau of Inquiry and Analysis, or BEA, launch an immediate investigation. In this case, they have all the information they need.
On récupère les 2 enregistreurs, les 2 boîtes noires, le CVR et DFDR, intacts. On a tous les éléments pour comprendre facilement les causes de l'accident.
Although the pilot should have been flying at 100 feet, they are actually at only 30 feet. The trees at the end of the runway were 40 feet tall.
They were 70 feet or so below what, in fact, their planned altitude was. If they would have been at 100 feet, odds are they would have been able to pass right over the trees and everything would have been fine.
Why was Asleen flying the plane so low?
I'm pretty sure I was flying 100 feet, and I'm a good pilot enough to fly at 100 feet sharp. But then, we were not at 100 feet, we were lower than that.
Captain Asleen explains the error by blaming the plane's barometric altimeter. which he says read 100 feet. It was not the first time that altimeter issues were implicated in a crash. 18 years earlier, in November 1970, Southern Airways Flight 932 is flying from Kinston, North Carolina, home to Huntington, West Virginia. It's a wintry night, and the weather is treacherous. Captain Frank Abbott and his crew are flying the illustrious Marshall University football team, the Thundering Herd, along with coaches and supporters. On board the Douglas DC-9 was young player Marcelo Lauterman.
Marcelo Lauterman, who was a good friend of mine in college, may be the best kicker I've ever seen.
Another team favorite is Bobby Wayne Hill.
Bobby was unbelievably excited about the trip. I think the fact that they were flying was a big deal.
Joining them is their popular athletics coach, Charles Colts.
My dad loved the university, and he had an unwavering passion for the university to have the football team be successful, and everybody was so excited. Most of them had not been on a plane before, so they had no idea what to expect, so they were excited.
The aircraft leaves Huntington at 6:38 p.m. and is expected to arrive 52 minutes later. At the time of the flight, Dan Shoemaker is at a drive-in movie.
I actually had a date that night, and we went to the drive-in movie at the Cerrito Drive-In, which was a drive-in theater that was at the base of the mountain hill that the airport was on the top of. And if you were an 18-year-old boy going to the drive-in movie, you didn't have to pretend to watch the movie.
At 7:20 p.m., the crew begin their approach to Huntington Tri-State Airport.
It's so dark out there.
The visibility is really poor tonight.
Low out there this evening.
If you look at the topography of West Virginia, you know, it's nicknamed the Mountain State. Airports typically, whether it's Huntington or Charleston or some of the other airports in the state, are located on the mountaintops or the plateaus to give you the best possible approach, but it also makes the approaches tight.
It's a notoriously tricky airport for pilots to navigate.
There wasn't a lot of margin for error at Tri-State. The runway was fairly short. At the time, that was a relatively large plane.
At 7:23 p.m., the crew established radio contact with the Huntington Airport air traffic controllers.
Southern 932, the Huntington weather 300 scattered, measured ceiling 500 variable broken.
It was wet, it was rainy, it was foggy all day long. My mother kept saying, you know, I wish they were able to stay the night and then fly in the morning because the weather was just difficult that day.
I cannot see a thing.
Southern 932, Huntington approach control, you are cleared for an approach. Correction, you are cleared for a localizer 1-1 approach.
The pilots are cleared to start their approach. The last transmission is received at 7:34 p.m. The aircraft is expected to maintain its altitude at 1,240 feet until the pilots see the runway. But they inexplicably drop too low.
1,000 feet above the ground. Rate and speed. Good.
In the fog, the crew have no visual clues to tell them that they are flying straight towards a mountain.
All right, keep an eye out.
Yeah.
Beginning to lighten up a little on the ground here at 700 feet. Should see it by now. That refinery should be off to our left. 400.
Pitch black.
Southern 932, this is Huntington Approach. Can you hear me? Southern 932, can you hear me?
As you looked up, you know, there was the glow in the sky of a fire. It certainly was an eerie sight.
Emergency services rush to the site. They can see it is hopeless.
Unfortunately, there was very little left of the plane because of the speed in which it struck the mountain.
All 4 crew members and 71 passengers perish, including the entire football team.
If you look at the state of the bodies and the size of the debris field, this was a completely unsurvivable crash.
We were waiting for Dad to come home, and it was around 8 o'clock, so we knew what time the flight would be arriving. And we started getting concerned, and the TV came across the screen, which is very unusual for an alert, a ticker tape. And it just said a plane had gone down at the Tri-State Airport. And immediately, my mother knew.
In such a small community, the loss of life is devastating.
That airline tragedy ripped the community apart. There were 66, I believe, is the number of kids who lost one or both parents that night.
The next day, Dan Shoemaker's friends, Marcelo and Bobby, aren't at school.
I remember going back to class and, you know, the empty seats. So, you know, that's when it really sank in for everybody.
In the community, there were so many people, and we knew them all. And it was just a tragic activity.
It's not just a local tragedy. The impact is felt across the United States.
The Marshall plane crash has often been called the greatest air tragedy in American sports history.
So why did the pilots fly too low? The National Transportation Safety Board tried to piece together the events. The pilots seemed confident in their altitude, but somehow, something had gone disastrously wrong. Captain John Cox has consulted on numerous air crashes with the NTSB.
What occurred was that the airplane continued to descend not only below its minimum altitude, but actually below that of the runway.
Investigators retrieved the black boxes and altimeters from the wreckage. They suspect that there might be an issue with the aircraft's altimeters. But in 1970, the instruments are crude. Unlike the Airbus A320, in which the pilots had fully computerized systems, the pilots flying the DC-9 had to manually react to information from basic instrumentation.
Early back at this time, this is 1970, we're talking almost 50 years ago, the equipment didn't exist. It was a lot of stick and rudder flying.
Like most planes of the era, there are 2 types of altimeter on board. A barometric altimeter reads air pressure, which consistently increases the closer the plane gets to sea level. The barometric altimeter is generally considered to be the more reliable indicator of altitude. Investigators discover that the barometric altimeter isn't working properly. But no one can be sure whether it was damaged in the crash. The radio altimeter works like radar, sending signals to the ground and measuring the returning echo. But when the terrain below is uneven, radio altimeters can give false readings. The hills surrounding Huntington Airport are exactly the kind of terrain to cause confusion.
You would not use the radio altimeter. You would descend the airplane to a barometric altitude and hold that till you came over the threshold of the runway.
The onboard voice recorder may also help investigators. When they locate it, it gives them a treasure trove of information. The voice recorder suggests that in the fog, the crew may have confused the lights from a local plant with runway lights, resulting in visual confusion.
Refinery should be off to our left.
As the airplane descended, there's questions about what the pilots can see. Do you see the runway? Not yet. But there are lights underneath that are very bright. There's a refinery that they fly over. And did they believe that those were the initial runway lights? That's unclear, but it's certainly something that the investigators looked at.
More importantly, investigators discover the pilots were unaware they were at the wrong altitude.
1,000 feet above the ground. Rating speed. Good.
They make a breakthrough and discover at a critical point the co-pilot's readings start to diverge from the proper altitude.
On the cockpit voice recorder, you hear discussions about altitude, which is very normal. And the first officer, he makes altitude call-outs that are initially very accurate, but as the airplane descends, there is a discrepancy between what he is saying and where the airplane actually is.
Critically, the co-pilot thinks the plane is much higher than it actually was.
700 feet.
He calls 700 feet, when in fact, he's at around 500 feet. This discrepancy of about 200 feet continues throughout the descent.
600.
There were no anomalies on the engines. The airplane wasn't falling out of the sky. All the control capability was there. But there may well have been a problem with the altimeter.
400.
Although far from conclusive, the investigators believe that the crash was either a result of one or both of the altimeters giving faulty readings, or the pilots reading them incorrectly. Could an altimeter be to blame for the Air France crash at Habsheim? Or did Captain Asleen misread the altimeter? Captain Asleen remains adamant that his barometric altimeter was giving false readings. But whether faulty or not, Asleen had a backup, the radio altimeter. But he argues that the radio altimeter was so small and badly designed that no one bothered to look at it.
You were not trained or used to use a standby altimeter. The emergency instruments are so small that we never use it.
After much testing, investigators declare that both the altimeters are in perfect working order. So on a clear day and perfect conditions, what could have led the experienced cockpit team to have come in so low? Investigators eventually discover a major clue in the cockpit recordings. On the final approach, the pilots were thrown a curveball when Asleen discovers that they'd been given instructions to fly over the wrong runway.
And when we arrived, we discovered this small airport I never seen before. And I could see the main runway, no problem. And we realized that all the spectators, they were not along the runway, they were on the side, on the grass runway. So I told Pierre, the show is there, we have to pass over the grass runway.
The crew now hurriedly recalculate their approach towards the grass runway. Could this last-minute hiccup have played a part in the tragedy? History tells us that even small changes to routine can lead to catastrophe. Christmas 1995 in Miami. American Airlines Flight 965 is taking 156 passengers and 8 crew members to Cali in Colombia. Just 4 days before Christmas, many are going to visit family for the holidays. On board is 21-year-old Mercedes Ramirez, a student traveling with her parents.
We were going to Colombia to visit my father's side of the family. It was around Christmas time, and the day that we actually left was my birthday. So the trip was going to be a combination birthday present / Christmas present. This was going to be a very special trip for our entire family.
Frustratingly, Flight 965 is delayed. It leaves nearly 2 hours behind schedule. The delay puts extra pressure on Captain Nicholas Tafori and First Officer Donald Williams to catch up for lost time during the 3-hour and 12-minute flight. Mercedes is sitting by the window next to her mother. Her father is in the row behind.
Once we finally started going on our way, there was a young man who was seated next to my mom that was a college student. He appeared to be around my age, and so my mom struck up a conversation with him, asking him, who he was and who he was going to visit in Colombia. And I remember feeling a little embarrassed because I could see her directing the conversation back to me, as in, talk to my daughter.
Mercedes decides to move to sit next to her father by the wing exit. Cali Airport has unique geography. It's situated at the end of a mountainous valley.
Cali Airport is located around a mountainous area, lots of mountains, lots of valleys. It is not always the easiest airport to do an approach and a landing in.
Flight attendants, please prepare for landing. Thank you.
As Flight 965 approaches Cali, Colombia, the crew confirm their approach for runway 01. They then receive a welcome message.
965, Cali.
965, go ahead, please.
Are you able to approach runway 19er?
Yes, sir. We'll need a lower altitude right away,
Cali Air Traffic Control offer Captain Tafori the chance to fly directly into the airport on a quicker route.
As it got toward Cali, the air traffic controllers gave them, because of the clear weather and no wind, gave them the ability to come straight in. The pilots liked that idea, given the fact they believed they could pick up some time. So with that, they began to configure the airplane for that approach.
It will be First Officer Donald's first time flying to Cali Airport. And although Captain Tafori's flown into Cali many times before, he has rarely landed at runway 19. The pilots consult the charts to feed the coordinates for the new runway into the computer.
They had to make all of the changes by hand while they're still moving at more than 250, 300 miles an hour and coming down.
The crew make final preparations before landing in this mountain airport.
Flight attendants, please prepare for landing. Thank you.
Mercedes remembers the moment she first noticed something was severely wrong.
I was shaken awake from feeling the plane be pulled straight up into the air. We started flying up like we were in some sort of rocket ship. And during that time, I remember the plane just kept on climbing and climbing in altitude. And I could feel my stomach was just dropping. And during that time, my instinct was just to hold on to my father's hand. He didn't say a word. He was quiet, but I could feel him squeezing my hand back. During that whole time, I just kept on thinking, okay, just fix it. Just straighten it out. Just straighten out this plane.
A mountain range is looming out of nowhere. In the cockpit, the pilots desperately try to pull up, but it's too little, too late.
My final memory of that was hearing this loud booming sound. It just sounded like a huge explosion that came from the back of the plane. I didn't realize at the time that that sound was the actual airplane making impact with the mountain. When I woke up, I just assumed that I was in my uncle's house, and so I started to feel around me. And nothing made sense. Everything was really blurry. Everything was just very confusing to me, but I kept on thinking, where am I? My mind and my body weren't obeying one another. I wanted to stand up, but I couldn't. And as I was looking around, I remember rubbing my eyes a lot and squinting, because I couldn't see, because I didn't have my glasses on. And so as I was trying to make sense of everything, I did realize that the bottom half of my leg, everything from the middle of my right thigh on down, was folded and tucked behind me. And so as I'm yelling for help and looking at my leg, finally I heard the voice of a man. And he kept telling me, if you can reach my hand, I can pull you out. And so that's what I did. Once I was pulled out, then I realized that it was actually the young man who'd been seated next to my mother during the flight. And I recognized his face just because we were talking during that flight, and I just remember that it was him.
Mercedes, the young man, and 2 other survivors wait for 18 hours to be rescued.
It was like just straight out of a movie when they finally started lowering people on ropes from those helicopters to come and get us. It was just a huge sense of relief, and I remember crying, saying that they found us. I was the last of the 4 survivors to be taken off the mountain. And so I remember as I was being airlifted off that mountain, I was scared to death, holding on to the cot. But basically in my mind, I thought, I've made it this far. I'll be darned if this rope breaks as I'm dangling from a helicopter. I just survived a plane crash. I don't want to have anything happen as I'm being dangled from a string.
Among the 160 people who died in the crash were Mercedes' parents.
When you are flying in this kind of a condition and you're basically hitting the mountain at speeds like, 200 miles, 250, perhaps 3, it's very, very difficult, if not impossible, to survive a crash like this.
Why was it of such big severity that almost everybody lost their life in this accident?
This accident was probably the worst 757 accident we'd ever seen.
What was responsible for this tragic loss of life? As the investigators examine the black boxes, they begin to unravel what happened that night in the cockpit.
You able to approach runway 19er?
Yes, sir. We'll need a lower altitude right away, though.
When the pilots had a last-minute offer of a different runway, they gladly set about reprogramming the plane's onboard computer with the new coordinates.
Take a Rosso 1 and runway 19er.
Once the computer knows where it's supposed to go, it checks its course against waypoints, electronic beacons that give the aircraft a fixed point on the ground. All approach calculations refer to these known positions. But in the rush, the pilot told the computer to be guided by the wrong waypoint.
Can American Airlines 965 go direct to Rosso and then take the Rosso arrival, sir?
They needed the next waypoint, and they needed it quickly. They put in the letter R, believing it was Rosso. That's what they were supposed to be heading toward. Well, R was a duplicate in this particular area for Romeo, and Romeo was a waypoint toward Bogota, which meant the flight management system in its automatic capacity was actually flying and taking the airplane toward Bogota.
Oblivious, the autopilot takes them over the mountains towards Bogota. The pilots continue their descent, not realizing that they are flying into a different valley and heading straight towards a vast mountain range.
They put down the speed brakes because they wanted to get in and slow the airplane faster.
They realize something is drastically wrong when the ground proximity alarm warns them that the plane is about to hit terrain. The pilots immediately try to pull out of the descent. But in the panic, they fail to realize that they had left the speed brakes on. Investigators suspect that it was this simple oversight that led to the disaster.
There is a belief that this airplane could have actually maneuvered over the mountain. The problem that they had, and they didn't realize it, is that by virtue of continuing to keep the speed brakes down, they basically were slowing their ability to climb.
A simple last-minute change of flight plan led to a cascade of errors.
It became clear, to my understanding, that it was pilot error, that the pilots had entered in the wrong code into the flight computer.
The last-minute change to the runway led to mistakes being made. Ultimately, the pilots lost track of where they were.
We think that this was a loss of situational awareness. They may well have realized that they may have been off course, but they didn't realize what their altitude was and how far off course they were.
American Airlines Flight 965 shows how last-minute changes to the flight plan can spiral into a disaster. So could the last-minute adjustments to Asleen's approach at Habsheim have contributed to the accident? It wasn't until Asleen was close enough to make visual contact that he realized that the audience were not where he expected them to be. In fact, they were beside a grass runway positioned at an angle of 40 degrees from his approach.
The flight plan was only given to the pilots the morning of the flight, so they were somewhat unfamiliar with what the plan was and also the airport itself.
Asleen doesn't believe the adjustment was significant.
It's a question of, I just quick look to my co-pilot, okay, we're lying on the runway, on the grass runway, okay, talk, this was done. It's nothing. It's so easy when you fly your aircraft, it's nothing.
Nevertheless, investigators are at a loss to explain why Asleen didn't realize they were flying too low. More critical still, the pilots were unaware that at the end of the new runway lay a forest.
There was a pictogram showing that I believe there were bushes.
At the time of this accident, there was no display of obstacles, terrain, much less something that is no taller than a tree.
Could Captain Asleen have pulled up in time? By the time Asleen realized they were in trouble, the engines had no time to respond to the increased throttle and pull them out of danger.
Put forward my throttle, then I realized, I have nothing. Nothing came.
Captain Asleen maintains to this day that the Airbus throttle was unresponsive.
The first one was this decision to fly at low speed. The second one, that the engine did not spool up for a technical reason, mechanical reason. Then it led to a crash. It led to the crash. That's as simple as that.
The investigation finds no fault with the Airbus mechanics or computer systems and concludes that the accident resulted from the combination of very low flyover height, very low speed, and late application of thrust to the engines. The late identification of Habsheim Airport was also to blame. Captain Asleen and First Officer Mazier are found guilty of involuntary manslaughter. Air France officials and the president of the flying club sponsoring the airshow are also convicted for poor planning and breaching altitude regulations. Since the Air France Flight 296 crash at Habsheim, a law has been introduced which prevents display aircraft having members of the public on board. The loss of life, the heartache that many people went through losing their children and loved ones, wasn't in vain. As a result of other disasters, altimeters have been improved, and today all commercial aircraft have ground proximity warning devices and improved navigational software. But last-minute changes to any routine will always carry the danger of unexpected consequences.
Accidents are always more than one thing. There are a chain of events which, in fact, come together to give you a catastrophic ending. If you've taken one of the events out, one of the chains in the link, odds are the accident wouldn't have happened. Even with experience, experienced pilots unfortunately make mistakes. They're human.
Despite everything, commercial flights still remain the safest form of transport in the world.